When we're talking about Iraq, I mean, I was born in Iraq, and although I never got to spend too much time, I spent my entire life outside of Iraq. But when talking of Iraq, you know, my father always romanticizes Iraq, about the poetry, about the beauty, about the art, about the food, about you know, the two rivers, about civilization, all of these things. Unfortunately, though, I found recently that when raising the issue of Iraq, when with youngsters as young as my own sons, that the immediate image that comes to those young minds is an image of carnage, of horror, of violence, of bloodshed, of explosions.
Yeah.
And it almost breaks my heart to think that that is what, you know, we as the civilized world managed to do to a country simply because there was a lie perpetuated, which is that Iraq at the time had and possessed and was capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction. And 20 years on, things have not gotten better in Iraq.
No.
And I spoke only yesterday to some of my relatives trying to gauge what the situation was. And, you know, what really hurts is the fact that not only are people suffering immensely, but they have almost lost hope. And they speak as though, you know, this is it. Don't ask us. Don't ask, because this is how it is. How did we get here? How do we get here?
Well, like you said, for a lie. I mean, there's an argument that Iraq in the last 50 years has been the victim of the worst campaign by the Western imperial powers of any country in the world. I think if you look from the 80s through to the 90s after the first Gulf War, then Operation Desert Fox, then Operation Iraqi Freedom, to now, there's just constant interference, bombing, violence, and it's all about, we know what it's about. It's about the resources that Iraq holds. They call it actually, I used to work for the Financial Times, and there's a word they use for it. They call it the resource curse, which is kind of a counterintuitive idea that, because obviously, if you've got huge resources of oil or other minerals, then you would think,
the target of.
Well, yeah, but you'd also think it's a lucky thing, right? It shouldn't be called a curse. But even the financial establishment call it the resource curse because the stats show that if you have those kind of resources, then you will become the target for imperial powers who want to maintain control of them. And obviously, in 2009, all the big oil companies did return to Iraq. There were 2 rounds of awards that were given. BP and Shell returned. BP got Rumaila oil field in the south. They still have an interest, a large interest in that. Shell got another field in the south, actually. And as you say, it's a complete tragedy. The degree of human carnage that happened in Iraq, I don't think is well understood. I remember when I was researching my first book, which was about what the US military were up to in Iraq, around the times of the awful violence from 2004 to 2007-8. I mean, it's unbelievable reading reports on what was happening. I mean, complete daily massacres by the Americans, but also obviously insurgents. Awful war crimes like the Mahmudiyah massacre, Haditha, 2005 and 2006. Just constant violence and I mean, I feel like the whole of the Iraqi society must have some form of PTSD. You can't recover from that level of violence in the short term, and I think that it's a major crime, and it should be understood that way. It shouldn't be understood as what it's described as in the media now, which is a blunder. I mean, we can accept that it was, or you can accept in the mainstream media that it went wrong because obviously we all saw it on the television screens, but it didn't just go wrong. It was a major crime based on a lie that all the people involved knew was a lie. Came out in the Chilcot report in 2016. Alistair Campbell got the Iraqi dossier sexed up with information that they all knew was wrong. That came out in the Chilcot report. That is an outrage.
I mean, it's interesting that that Matt, you mentioned the resource curse. I recall talking to a tribal leader several years ago, 6-7 years ago, from Iraq. I met him at a conference in Istanbul, and I recall very, very vividly how he said, you know, it's very odd, but I pray day and night that the oil just dries up, that we wake up tomorrow and there is absolutely no oil, so that basically people and countries just forget about us for a while. Yeah. I remember how when he was talking so, it was so visceral, it was so real, it was so deep. During that time, when the war started in 2003, you were in New York, I believe.
I was handling the Middle East file at the Italian mission at the UN. And inside the Middle East file, at the time, the more important file was Iraq, 2002, 2004, and the Middle East peace process. These basically were the two main. But of course, very quickly, the Iraqi file took over on any other file. Yeah. And since September 2002, it was clear to us, especially after September 11, okay, but it was clear to us that no matter what, the Americans were going for war.
That was clear from September?
In our assessment, yes. It was not clear to the assessment because, you know, when you see such a big build-up in terms of logistic, in terms of media attention, in terms of spin, our experience being inside the system is that you do not build up such a circus just to stop one day and say, okay, we were wrong. That was the. And then the more we were approaching, the more we're close to the situation that was a point of no return, the more we're following the debate inside the Security Council about the authorization, the famous second resolution that was supposed to provide the legal coverage to the war, the more we realized that that administration, that U.S. administration at the time, was made clear informally, listen, we are going to go no matter what, even if we have the legal coverage. Because the 1991 operation, from the legal point of view, was carried out perfectly.
From the procedural point of view?
From the procedural point of view. There was the resolution 678, November 23rd, 1990. That basically all necessary means, the famous wording that in the UN and international law jargon means, okay, you're not going to do this, it's going to be all necessary consequences. It means war. And so it was clear for us, was frustrating at a certain extent, because we have been advising discreetly the Americans, listen, don't go to Iraq. Don't go to make it war. It's not going to be a cakewalk, as you believe. I remember at the time, I read a few years later that before the war, Tony Blair at the time consulted 4 of the top British experts on Middle East. One of them was, I think, Toby Dodge, that professor at the London School of Economics. And other 3, all of the 4 top experts that were consulted by British government advised against going to war, to no avail. In the sense that sometimes these are the consultations that we are to say to wash your conscience. Yes, I consulted people, but then, you know, the issue has to be settled. And
remember at the time the public prosecutor, who was it? Goldsmith, was it? who was advised,
the ruling of top
this was wrong. This
top
was
legal
illegal.
advisor.
Yeah, well,
There was
remember the Catherine Gunn case, the GCHQ whistleblower?
Exactly.
She got off because the government didn't want to have to release the legal advice that was clearly,
That
they were
was,
saying it wouldn't be.
Elizabeth Wilhurst, I believe, was. I used to know her because when I entered in the Foreign Service, she was in the legal department of the Foreign Office dealing with Antarctica. Believe what? And she was upset by the fact that the ruling by Goldsmith that was against legally that the war was tricky. The legal case was tricky. Let's say that it was tricky, to say the least, was not released immediately.
And yet we're here now when not a single person who was involved has ever faced a single day in court, which is incredible, really, isn't it? When I mean, because there's a lot of imperial crimes that have been perpetrated by the US and UK since Dot, But for me, this was just such a clear that even the rationale that was given didn't stack up at all. It was so obvious, and yet even in that case, not a single person has faced any kind of criminal proceedings. The only person who's in jail now in London is Julian Assange, who did more than anyone to expose the crimes of Iraq and Afghanistan. So for me, that's a very, very clear way of understanding how our society works.
You know, I mean, this is interesting because, I mean, during those times, and that's why I asked about September 2002, because from probably July, August, when the beat of the drums of war began to become more rapid, the anti-war movement came together. I, at the time, was at the Muslim Association of Britain, Stop the War Coalition, CND. We came together and we organized a huge demonstration on around the 22nd of September 2002, warning against the war in Iraq. And at the time, I have to say that we were extremely hopeful, seeing the crowds, because there was something like 500,000 at the time, filling the streets of central London. And we were quite hopeful that the global movement in opposition to the war was going to win the day. And then we started organizing for the 2 Million March, which then became on the 15th of February 2003. And that was just before the discussion at the Security Council where Colin Powell...
I was in that room that day.
Oh, really?
Wow. And I have to say, you know, I'm no expert, but I have to say, I was looking at the images that Colin Powell, a seemingly quite intelligent man, was pointing to the screen and showing, and I was thinking, how could you tell from these images?
Let me tell you something. I was in the room, because it was an open session of the Security Council. It was not a closed session.
Yeah.
And the people, what we are called the people in the system, or the diplomats, none of the people that were inside that room were impressed in terms of proofs that were presented in that room. Yeah. But we realized at the time that it was not anymore a matter of proofs.
It was just
a decision that, listen, as far as we learned later that military planning had just started in the spring 2002. Yeah. Someone said that even immediately after September 11, I was in New York on September 11, was quite quite an experience in order to see how the reaction of the American people, the reaction of the American media establishment, American political establishment was... I will never forget that the first 48 hours, I'm just shifting for a second from Iraq, but just to give you a sort of how they used to think at the time, and it was a endless discussion with my American friends at the time, is that the first 48 hours, 72 hours, the only question the journalists were asking, how it was possible. They were shocked that these people could carry out the terrorist, brutal, horrible terrorist attack that was taken. So they were asking technicalities, how we have been taken by surprise, why we have not been able to
stop,
prevent, understand. And nobody was asking why they did it. The first question I would, in terms of forensic and investigation, I have to understand how the operation was carried out, where were
but also
the
what the
mistakes,
motive was.
but at the end, the motivation.
Yeah.
And so I said, but are you not interested about the motivation?
Yeah.
And then came George W. Bush that gave this statement that was, I will never forget it. They did it because they hate what we are.
Yeah.
And I remember one night in New York in a very heated discussion with some American friends, I said, maybe it's true, but have you ever considered that they did what they did? It is an inexcusable, full condemnation, etc. Have you ever for a moment considered that maybe you should ask yourself that they don't do what they didn't do what they did because of what you are, but because of what you do
did.
or did.
Yep.
And that was the discussion. And in
But
a way,
that was that kind of discussion was off the table. I mean, we couldn't have that discussion. I mean, as far away as in London, we couldn't have that discussion.
yeah, the shock. Let's say that the shock was so big. You remember basically NATO came out claiming Article 5 immediately a few days after. And even the American were a little embarrassed because, no, we don't need Article 5 because basically the European overreacted in terms to be forthcoming with the United States after such an horrible attack had been carried out. And then again, the discussion, I tell you a personal story that maybe could be useful. Let's jump after the war. There was the embarrassing moment in June 2003, let's say, where they were looking for weapons of mass destruction all around Iraq.
Yes.
And these weapons of mass destruction didn't come out. And this was becoming also a very embarrassing situation for all the Western European governments that supported the war. And among that governments, there was the Italian government at the time. And because, as you remember, France and Germany with Russia, they took a different position.
Correct.
And they basically blocked the second resolution in the Security Council. One day, a little bit exasperated by the situation, also because the pressure from Rome, I asked to my American counterpart, and I provide a typical, very pragmatic Italian-style recipe, if I could say so. For God's sake, take a few weapons, just bury somewhere, and then discover it. End of the story. And I will never forget that the American colleague was shocked by my suggestion because he said, we don't do these things.
Oh dear, oh my word.
So at that moment I realized that when you have a big power that, and in believing in its own propaganda, it's over.
Correct.
That was basically the moment I say, okay.
Yeah, it's over.
It's over.
Listen, 20 years on. In fact, not 20 years on. 1 year on. Remember that the Correspondents' Dinner where George W. Bush made fun of himself at the podium saying, oh, maybe weapons of mass destruction are here, maybe they're under this table. It was horrible. I remember watching that.
But was clever. Listen, was clever for the Western audiences. Because basically put the issue in terms of laughing. It was a show, a talk show, entertainment show. People were distracted by that. Because basically you see a president, usually in the Correspondent Dinner, the American president act and jokes and sense. But in that way, it was a way to banalize all the issue. And was very clever.
I see. But it was utterly horrible.
And sick.
Yes.
I mean,
it was, absolutely.
Did you see it? And recently, he was talking about Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, but he said Iraq instead. Yeah, exactly.
Because it's
quite Freudian, isn't it?
It's Freudian. Yes.
It's absolutely
Freudian moment.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
It's funny because well, not funny, but I wonder from his perspective what he thinks about it. Because obviously, from an outsider's perspective, we know that he launched a criminal war which completely destroyed a country. And as you said earlier, it's not recovered and may never recover. I mean, the level of savagery which happened there takes generations, may not ever recover. But he's getting fed different information to us, and he has to come up with a way of rationalizing what he did. So in his head, I wonder if he can make those kind of jokes, because he still thinks, no one wants to look in the mirror and think they're a monster. So he would have rationalized it in some way, I think. And they're just protected from the results of what they do a lot of the time, especially him retired doing those awful paintings in Texas. And it's the same with the population at large. We are protected from the real consequences of our foreign policy. And you see that very, very clearly with Iraq, but it operates across the board. People have barely any knowledge about the UK's role in the world, and even more so in the US. So, I mean, what should happen is they should all be tried, and we should be talking about them the way we're talking about Putin. Because if you look at how the media, a lot of the establishment media here, they laugh at the crude Russian propaganda about Ukraine, and there is a lot of it. But yet these are the same people that echoed, amplified propaganda, which was even more ridiculous from the Bush and Blair administrations. Because if you look at the WMDs, which, as you said, weren't found, and they actually knew, well, the intelligence they were getting was that they couldn't say with any degree of certainty that he had a weapons of mass destruction program, but they went forward anyway. And then there was none were found. That propaganda is more ridiculous than Putin saying that he invaded Ukraine to denazify the country, because although obviously that is propaganda, there are Nazis in Ukraine. So at least there's a kernel of truth. There wasn't even a kernel of truth with the WMD. But we have a completely different way of looking. I'm talking about the mainstream media here. We have a completely different way of looking and analysing and understanding an official enemy's foreign policy and our own. Iraq was a major crime. The people involved should be tried. We can say that about Putin. Why can't we say that about our own leaders? Yeah. And that's a whole other discussion. But for me, I think that for some kind of remedy and salving the pain and of Iraq would be to bring these people to justice. It's never going to happen, but there should be a movement for it. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, it was quite interesting when the Labour leader who was elected in 2015, initially there was talk that they were going to push for Tony Blair to be tried. Yeah. And that kind of, I don't know quite what happened with that, but it kind of got lost in the general, but he was a lone mainstream voice saying that. And I think
people forget that he actually made an apology to the Iraqi people for the war. Yes. I mean, and he stood alone amongst the array, of Western leaders in doing so. But there was something that Marco said that interested me, and that is the media, the role of the media. You see, I'm a linguist. I mean, my first degree and my master's was in translating and interpreting. So language is very close to me, and I've studied language quite closely. And I am aware, and I think most people are aware, that the very first step towards war is language. Is the words that you use, the way in which you portray the other, using words like a monster, or someone who is rabid, or, you use these words and they usually mean that this is something which is about to sort of progress, about to take off, about to get even worse. And out of the array of narratives or discourses that were employed and used by the media in order to soften the progress of the likes of the UK and the US towards war, I recall very, very well, early on at around November, December time, when there was a determined narrative that Iraq, under the previous regime, under Saddam Hussein, was actually made up of three totally isolated communities: Sunnis, Shi'is, and Kurds. Now, the very first thing that came to my mind was that someone must have made a mistake, because, I mean, okay, Sunnis, Shias, you're talking about religion, but then Kurds, you're talking about nationalism. So, you would say Arabs and Turks, and you would say Muslims and Christians, for instance, or Yazidis. Why would you make it that? And that started to gain momentum. And then all of a sudden, everyone was talking about Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. I recall I attended, I spoke at a BBC Live audience, a panel made up of about 6 or 7 speakers at the time. And we were backstage awaiting to be called in, introduced, and then called in so we take our seats. And I remember it was my turn. So I was starting to walk, and then I stopped because I was hearing all of a sudden our next panelist is an Arab Sunni Iraqi, and it was the very first time in my entire life
that you were characterized
that I was
in the
so I stopped because who was this? I didn't even recognize myself, despite the fact that I am Arab, despite the fact that I am Sunni, but I never identified according to that. That filled me with worry. And I remember mentioning this in several of the demonstrations and the public meetings leading up to the war, saying that this is dangerous because what's going to happen is that essentially it might be just words, but they are words that will have consequences.
Yes.
And ultimately, they will be acted upon. And in fact, what we ended up with was exactly that. We ended up with a sectarian state, a sectarian regime that has this, Sunnis have so much, and Shias have so much, and Kurds have so much, and this quarrel that I don't know how long it'll take, a generation or two, but probably even more, to remedy, if at all.
Anas, you know, and I don't want to sound too critical of the journalistic profession, but we have to admit the fact that the professionalism of these operators has been downgraded in the last decades, and we know that journalists need to oversimplify issues because sometimes they under time constraints. You are 30 seconds. You have to. But sometimes an excessive oversimplification doesn't make a good service for the people they should understand. Yes, journalists, they have to provide the news, but sometimes they also should at least help the people to understand what's behind certain news. In the last 20 years, what I noticed that is quite concerning for me is the Manichaean tone and attitude that is characterizing especially Western media. So there's basically everything becomes some zero game.
Yeah.
It's I'm the evil, you are the evil, I'm the good.
Yeah.
And we are seeing at play today also with the issue of the war
Ukraine and Russia. Yeah.
And there's also a second issue that is more philosophical, if I can raise from my point of view, is that you quite remember Edward Said in Orientalism that used to say that sometimes the West defines itself for what is not. And this is something that is going back to 5th century before Christ with the Greek vis-a-vis the barbarians, the Persian, and say, so sometimes I need someone, I need an enemy that I portray as different from me, bearing different values for me, in order to reinforce myself in my own conviction.
The legitimacy.
And so on. And I'm still surprised after a quarter of a century to see how easily and how quickly in the media spin tends to create enemy. Yeah. You remember the famous American president John Quincy Adams that used to say the United States should not go along the world in search of monsters to destroy. And if you characterize everything as a monster, and so these basically apocalyptic terms, where is diplomacy? Where is the understanding? Where is the mediation? Basically, you lose everything. And this is what we are watching. We have been watching in the Balkans.
Yeah.
We have been watching in the Middle East. We have been watching now, unfortunately, again in Ukraine. I need an enemy. And sometimes I tend to believe that our Western society in particular, we need an enemy. We need an external enemy in order to distract people from the big enemies that usually is inside us, and it's not outside. But the more you distract people with the enemy outside, the more you keep going in terms of your political and your politics.
You see, I mean, the way you put it, Marco, I mean, you start to sympathize with Trump's fake news sort of slogan, because to a large extent, I mean, that's what we've been having. And you know, it always gets me how, since I was little, and I remember a conversation between two teachers. I think I was about 7 years old. And I remember this quite well. Two teachers were having a discussion and someone said, well, you know, it's going to rain or something. And he said, oh, really? Where did you... In the papers. Oh, don't believe anything you read in the papers. That was something that was commonly said. It was widespread. Why is it that the media have so much leverage?
Yeah, and it's interesting what Marco was saying about what's happened in the last 2 decades, because I do think there's something sinister has happened to the mainstream media in terms of there's been it's become even more closed than it was previously. It's always had a propaganda function in the Free West, the media, but there was space for dissent and mavericks within that general edifice. Like you'd have a Seymour Hersh or a John Pilger, or Paul Foot, but they don't. Those people can't write for the mainstream media anymore. They've squeezed out even the little bits of dissent that exist. Seymour Hersh now writes on Substack. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, arguably
used to write.
For New
first
York.
it was a New Yorker, and then they didn't allow anymore. Then it's the London Review of Books, and then the London Review of Books.
But I've been trying to understand that, because for me that's a contradiction with what we've seen happening, the democratization of the media, like with the internet, Twitter, blogs, being able to set up your own outlets. You would have thought that would put pressure on the legacy institutions to open up more.
Exactly.
But the opposite has happened. And I don't really understand that. But I do actually think it's maybe linked to Iraq, because if you remember, although a lot of the media did amplify the propaganda, there were sections of the media which were really a problem for the governments. Maybe not in the US, but here, if you remember what Piers Morgan's Daily Mirror did, it was unbelievable. You really saw what a campaigning newspaper could be like. And they did one front page, which was, the headline was made up of oil companies' logos.
I remember that.
Very, very powerful. You would never, ever get that now. Piers Morgan was eventually fired after quite a sinister fake story was fed to them. I don't know what happened there. But I think that the powers that be realised at that point that the media needed to be brought in to heal even more than it was. And the last 20 years has been a definite sea change in what can be published in the newspapers and what you're saying, like the kind of criticism or at least analysis of the propaganda coming from the government. It doesn't exist anymore in the same, like particularly in somewhere like The Guardian, which published the early WikiLeaks releases in 2011, 12. It's become completely homogenous.
Absolutely.
You can get one view, and it's the establishment view and nothing else. And it is very sinister. I think that just to go back to something else you were saying, Marco, about the 9/11 attacks as well. What was so amazing about the power of propaganda in that is that 15 of those 19 hijackers were Saudi. Who is the US's biggest ally in the Middle East. No one talks about that. Then obviously the figures within the Bush administration have been pushing for all-out war with Iraq during the late 90s. They were angry at the first Bush for not going through and taking him out in 1991. And they actually, a part of the propaganda, it wasn't just WMDs. If you remember, they were trying to link Saddam to Al-Qaeda. Through very, very, extremely, in many ways, ridiculous propaganda. A lot of it came from that different sources. Curveball was more the WMD, but there were other ones about yellow cake and uranium. But the 9/11, like the US government is still refusing to declassify files. They're being sued by the families of the 9/11 victims to try and get information about the Saudi involvement in 9/11. It's madness. Like how has the propaganda system managed to make it that?
By the way, it's also quite odd because just over the past 2 days, the BBC has been publishing stories taken from the Iraq files, including. Only yesterday I read or a few days ago, I read the testament of the CIA agent who interviewed Saddam Hussein personally, one-to-one, for about 2 months.
Right.
2 to 3 months. And he mentioned certain things. He said, Saddam Hussein found out within 30 seconds that I was Lebanese, of Lebanese origin, and that I was Christian. And when asked, for instance, okay, so what were the main things that you found out about Saddam fairly quickly? And one of the things was, and this is in the BBC report, that he loathed Osama bin Laden, that he hated Osama bin Laden. This was a CIA agent speaking of his personal encounters with, surely, sometimes there's, in Arabic, there's a saying in Ammi, in colloquial Arabic, and that is that someone says, how do you know it's a lie? He says, from how big it is, from how extraordinarily big it is. And this was a big lie. This was a huge lie.
Well, Goebbels used to say, the bigger the lie, the more the people are going to believe it.
But a large percentage of the US population believed before the war in Iraq that Saddam and Al-Qaeda
were in cahoots.
Yeah, exactly.
They were in collaboration.
Which was based on zero evidence. And that's how that was one of the main mechanisms they brought the population on side.
Let's take it a little bit outside. To be perfectly honest, we can talk about Iraq for hours because the situation is so dire. It's so extremely bad. For 20 years now, we're talking about a failed country that really doesn't have any kind of hope looming even in the horizon of the next 3 to 5 years. Where you're talking about uncountable. We don't know how many people are killed. Recently I was invited to a university in the north of England to talk about Iraq. And I mentioned the Lancet report that came out in around 2005, which said that there were 1 million Iraqis dead. So I quoted that. I said in 2005, and someone shouted me down saying, "No, that's just a lie." The Lancet is one of the most reputable medical journals there are.
Peer-reviewed.
So I immediately said, "Okay, can you tell me how many died? If not 1 million, how many? How many?" And the gentleman just stayed quiet because no one knows. And to an extent, that could be said also of Afghanistan. No one knows how many people were killed.
The latest data that have been provided by this, there's the cost of the war project of Brown University in the United States.
Yes.
I think they made an estimate calculation of 20 years of war until 2019, I believe, and I'm not sure. And the final estimate is about $8 trillion spent.
That's money.
Roughly 1 million people
killed
directly
because of the war. You see, because there are indirect deaths.
I think between Iraq and Afghanistan.
Okay.
But the most, 1 million people. And 38 million people, refugee or displaced.
There we go.
This is...
we're talking about a human catastrophe.
Huge catastrophe.
A human catastrophe, the size of which we haven't actually witnessed in our lifetimes, and probably even before that.
And this comes on the back of the sanctions in the 90s.
Of course.
And then the no-fly, the Operation Desert
Absolutely.
Fox. It's been constant for...
If I was a conspiracy theorist, and I'm not, I would like to assure everyone, one of my, the criticisms that come my way from my colleagues is, "Oh, Anas, you're always citing, you're accusing us of being conspiracy theorists." But if I was a conspiracy theorist, I would say the reason why George Bush Sr. didn't continue to Baghdad and to kick out Saddam Hussein when he clearly could was in order to create the premise for the sanctions that actually debilitated Iraq absolutely entirely. But I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the catastrophe is almost immeasurable. We're talking about the cost that at least 2 to 3 generations will be continually paying for, financially as well as in kind and emotions and stress and PTSD and all of these issues. But also, you served during the time of Daesh.
Yeah, in Iraq.
What kind of impact did the Iraq of 2003 have in creating the foreground for the rise of the likes of Al-Qaeda, the likes of Zarqawi, the likes of Daesh? That in itself beggars I don't know, begs an answer. I mean, what kind of impact did it have?
There was a huge impact among the population because most of them endure horrible destruction in order to be left in a situation where it was very, very difficult to carry out ordinary lives. Daesh is basically as byproduct of a country that went into a as a failed state. But the most, let me say, funny aspect that basically people used to say that Daesh was born in the American jail in Iraq because all these people were in a way put together in the same place.
Correct.
And up to a certain extent, I don't believe in the conspiracy theory that says that the American created Daesh. Doesn't make.
But maybe created the conditions.
Definitely.
But this is the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, okay.
These people, when you put them together, basically in jail, you are all together in a place. You create allegiances.
Of course.
You create affiliation. People talk among each other. There's someone that is basically lecturing the other. Basically, you created a breeding ground for what happened next. And in the hierarchy of the horrible person, of course, the people Daesh top, and then there's Al-Qaeda, and then there's all the other. Because when I was there, what was clearly theorized by Daesh was what it was called the management of savagery. It was basically a blueprint they printed. The more we are ruthless, the more we are going to prevail in the battlefield, even before, without fighting, because on the other side,
they'll just be scared because of what they hear.
And the tactic they used is just to say 1, 2, 3, 4 car bomb, one after the other. At the end of the day, when you have basically a sequence of car bombs coming every 2-3 minutes, one after the other, the only thing you can, if you have no tanks and if you have basically only with a gun, the only thing you can do is run away. Yeah. Because there's another kind of, if you have no air force, close air support to target and eliminate that. And basically this legend that was created by these fighters was basically so worrisome for everybody that in a way explain how they have been able to basically to take over almost all of Iraq in a matter of days, essentially.
But I think that the success that they saw was related to what you're saying, which is that it is a traumatized society. Yeah. And when you push a people that far, put so much trauma upon a society at large, they tend towards extremes. They do. It's like the rise of Nazi Germany happened in the aftermath of extreme economic difficulty, and I mean, in Iraq, it was the violence as well. So I think that the US obviously, I totally agree that I don't think they created it purposefully, but they created the conditions. They destroyed a society, and when you have that, and you have these lunatics running through, the conditions. 20 years ago, if Daesh had gone into Iraq, they would have just been kicked out instantly, by the people. Yeah. But there was a degree of desperation and trauma that just allowed them to prosper. And I mean, in 2014, it was crazy what happened. They took...
It occurred also in the 70s in Cambodia.
Right.
There was an explanation that basically the Khmer Rouge were so brutal, fanatic, because according to a theory, they have been exposed to massive bombings by the American planes in Cambodia. That they came out, this group of crazy people that started to behave in the way.
I think there's something to be said for that. I think there are parallels with that. Obviously, the ISIS didn't get into power; they didn't take, but I think there are quite similar, because that was an intense. What the Americans did in Laos and Cambodia. Was incredible. The amount of bombs they dropped in a short space of time completely destabilized the region and moved everyone from the countryside to people fled the countryside to the cities. So that, as you say, it was that kind of creating a new kind of tumult as well, like prison-style conditions.
When I was in Iraq, the main victims of Daesh were the Iraqis, the ordinary people.
Of course.
Basically. But Daesh were mostly Iraqis, right? There were Syrians as well,
Syrians
but I think the majority were meant to be Iraqi.
there were Tunisians, there were people who came from all across
Central Asia,
Yeah.
even from the Xinjiang.
Correct, yes.
The Xinjiang one are now, group of them is in Syria.
Yeah.
They came from everywhere. In terms of, it's funny that one of the data for me more shocking is in terms of ratio of a population, the major number of Daesh militants came from one of the more secular Arab countries that was Tunisia.
Correct, correct.
Tunisia was, in a way, in terms of secularity of the society, was very, very, very advanced compared to Iraq and other countries.
Absolutely.
And we had this huge number in terms of population ratio that were Tunisia. How is possible?
Yeah.
But I mean, it's quite interesting in the work I do, the British and the Americans as well have used jihadists and Islamic extremists for decades.
Yeah.
They've used them as an instrument, a foreign policy instrument.
How many have since emerged as being planted? They were agents for Canada and for other countries, and they became leaders within Daesh and the such. I mean, that's...
But this is an heritage of the Cold War, because they used militant Islam in the Arab world because they wanted to keep at bay the socialist and the pro-Soviet. So what I have available here to counter the socialist, the third world, and the affiliation, the Marxist-Leninists, the only one that I could use at the moment, at the time, were the Islamists, because basically they were against the atheism of this political force.
That's why the left is kind of
the problem is that basically they started losing the control of the game or of the toy, and as usually happened, one of the most famous words used in the Middle East is blowback.
But it still happens outside of the Cold War framework as well. But if you look at what happened in Syria, like Assad is a brutal dictator. What he did in Syria was a horrendous crime. But the Western powers were not didn't get involved there because they wanted to spread freedom and democracy. They armed alongside the GCC some of the and Israel as well, of some real unsavory Islamic extremists to fight that government. So it still carries on. And again, that war in Syria might have been over a lot quicker. I mean, Assad survives, but the civil war might have been over a lot quicker if they hadn't enacted operations like that.
That was a lot of overconfidence, because for 2 years attended what was called the London 11. It was a group of Western and Arab country managing the Syrian file. And in the discussion inside, there was someone, including me, that were raising the problem that you just mentioned, Matt. And listen, these people, but we can use them and then we get rid of them. Hey, listen, I said, the Afghanistan example in the 70s proves the contrary. These people, maybe they can take food from your hand, but then they are going to bite your hand. So at least let's try to have some history lesson properly learned. And as I don't remember if it was Hegel that used to say, if there's someone that human beings, they do not learn from history, is that they don't learn from history.
And Libya as well. Sorry, that's another example.
Tell me this. I mean, what have we learnt? I mean, and we're not just talking about ourselves as members of the public, because, I mean, I think that we could get most people today to describe what's happened in Iraq as a huge, at best case scenario, like the media puts it, a blunder. Worst case scenario, and I have many, many friends who actually supported war at the time who now call it a lie. It was a lie, it was a crime. But what do you think that states have learned from Iraq? I'll mention one thing that I always find absolutely fascinating, in that when, if you were to cast your minds to 100 years from now, you look back and see 2003 as the time when a British prime minister and an American president fought a military battle and won, were victorious, okay? In normal circumstances, we'd have a statue of Tony Blair standing in front of, I don't know, Westminster Palace, or we'd have a statue of George W. Bush in the White House gardens. But we don't. In fact, what we do have is, and as someone, a producer in one of the mainstream TV stations tells me, that whenever Tony Blair goes for an interview, one of the set conditions set by his team is, do not mention Iraq. And when I said this to a number of American friends, one of them, a publicist, said the very same thing about George W. Bush. Whenever he goes out for a meeting, the condition is never, ever mention Iraq.
Listen, Tony Blair is, in a way, I use in the, don't misunderstand me, it's a fascinating personality. I'll tell you why. Fascinating in the negative sense. It was 2007, he was almost leaving the prime ministerial job. He came at dinner in Rome with Romano Prodi, was
yes.
And between Prodi and Blair, there was some
dislike.
Bad blood, like linked to the enlargement of Europe.
Yes.
So Prodi told me and another colleague, when we sit at the table with Tony, unleash hell. So he started to talk about nuclear Iran and nuclear Iran and nuclear Iran. Basically the same script that we have been watching on Iraq.
Yeah.
So I look at Prodi, say, I go? He say, yes. Okay, Mr. Prime Minister, with all due respect, I would like to raise your attention on certain point. First of all, in Iraq, in Iran, we have basically multiple center of powers. So assuming that Iran will get a nuclear device, we have not one crazy man at the top that could decide in any moment to use the nuclear weapon. We have a country that is making his own calculation, that is not fanatic. In terms of international policy, they have their own calculation. I think we should give much more attention to a neighboring country that is Pakistan, that is almost overwhelmed by extremists, that Al-Qaeda and so. And Pakistan has nuclear weapons. We don't know if Iran has nuclear weapons, but definitely Pakistan has. And if some of these people, Al-Qaeda, and happen something in Pakistan, will take a nuclear weapon, you can be sure that they will use it. And Blair all the time was looking at me, nodding, and then when I finished, I said, he didn't say anything. He remained silent. So I didn't know if he agreed with me, if he disagreed, but he didn't want to say.
Did Prodi give you a promotion?
And so I said, if this is, and I was presenting a compelling case in that circumstance that basically we have to be careful about Iran nuclear weapons to prevent it. But please give a little bit of attention to another situation that risks to be much more dangerous.
Yeah. It's, yes. I mean, Matt, do you think that Iraq has taught Western leaders at I don't know what?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, isn't it? And it is true that there is a perception of the Iraq War which is kind of different to other campaigns the US and UK have fought since the end of the Second World War. There is I think a mainstream view that it was like based on a lie. I think the WMD thing really hit home. But my feeling is that the way that the history is written and the way the establishment exerts power is that over the years they rewrite history and the next generations forget what the situation is here. So if you look at the Vietnam War, for example, Lyndon Johnson is seen as now a hero in America, whereas the crimes that were committed in Vietnam were even worse than Iraq, actually. Yeah. They absolutely devastated Vietnam, absolutely devastated it. And even Nixon, who was his successor as president, he actually is kind of uniquely got a negative perception in the States. But that's not about what he did in Vietnam. It's about Watergate.
Yes.
So my feeling is, in 100 years' time, you were saying in 100 years' time, what will be the perception? I think the establishment historians, the establishment ideological defense mechanisms would have done their work, and all the stuff which is real that is mainstream felt would have kind of disappeared, because it will be fitting. Well, if we're all still here, we probably won't be here in 100 years if we carry on. But I'm not too optimistic, unfortunately. No, although I'll end one optimistic note is, you talked about the anti-war movement and the fact we were hopeful in 2002 and 2003 that we could stop it. We didn't do that, but I do think that the power of that anti-war movement did stop maybe future attacks from the United States. It put up it was a massive deterrent, because the Project for New American Century and a lot of the kind of extremists that were part of the American Enterprise Institute, which was a very influential think tank in Washington and still is, they wanted to go on to Iran. Correct. They wanted to go on to Syria. Correct. And they didn't. And they might have if there hadn't been such a massive outpouring of opposition to the war in Iraq.
They didn't learn anything, in my view. Yeah. And this will be the opinion in 1 year time, in 100 year time. And the blueprint, what is really worrying me, is basically the Iraqi blueprint. I see the same, is now implemented with China. It's the exactly blueprint, building the case for something. We don't know what is going to happen.